Thank you for coming out to the library. This is a lecture that's part of our One Book, One College program as we continue looking at James Baldwin's Giovanni's Room. It's been a good semester so far, and I'm really excited to welcome Dean Dwight McBride to campus. I've actually enjoyed the last hour just chatting, and I'm kind of sad that we have to actually start the formal program because I'd rather just sit and talk for another hour, but that's not why we're here. So let me just do a quick intro. Before I do that, let me say I want to thank the Democracy Commitment, especially Tammy Coleman-Hill and Dr. Salabarone and Jane Long for helping to make this program possible. So this is part of their programming as well. So thank you to them for that. Dwight McBride is the Dean of the Graduate School and Associate Provost at Northwestern University. He's the Daniel Hale Williams Professor of African American Studies, English, and Performance Studies. His PhD is from UCLA, and his bachelor's is from Princeton, and it's a rare treat for us to have somebody who really is at the forefront of this research on James Baldwin. He may be the most authoritative person on planet Earth to talk about James Baldwin, and he was willing to drive from Evanston all the way out to Palos Hills to do this. And if you know about geography, those are not necessarily easy places to get to, so thank you for that. But beyond the formal introduction, I've just had a great time chatting, so I look forward to this. So thank you, and I'll turn it over to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Troy, and thank you all for coming out today. If you guys want to move a little closer, that's perfectly fine. And if you need to leave early, that's perfectly fine. If you need to get coffee while we're talking, that's perfectly fine. I won't take offense. It takes a lot to offend me. So I'm delighted that you're here today. And delighted to have an opportunity to talk about not only a writer who is really near and dear to my heart, but also a book that is probably one of my favorite books of all time. Whenever people ask, like, what do you think I should read? What is a great book that you really you think that everyone ought to have a look at? Giovanni's Room is almost always one of the books that is on the short list for me. So these days, as Dean of the Graduate School at Northwestern, I have really pulled back a lot from travel and even doing some of the academic talks that I enjoy doing. But when this invitation came several months ago, because one, it was here, and two, it was Baldwin, and three, it was Giovanni's Room, I thought, okay, this is the stars aligning and saying, you need to do this. And so I'm delighted to be here. I have a little bit of experience myself. Some time ago, when I was a graduate student teaching in community college at Santa Monica College in Los Angeles, and I taught there for about 2 years. And I was saying to Troy earlier that really to date, some of the most compelling teaching experiences that I had were at Santa Monica College. And in part because the students were so, one, determined, they knew what they wanted to do. Many of them were returning students. They came back to school while they were working, part-time, full-time, but they were very, very focused, and I enjoyed working with those students very much. So I'm delighted to be here as well for that reason. The other reason is, and I will just say, the personal connection to this novel goes back to my own time as a graduate student. And I first encountered Baldwin as an undergraduate. It was one of the first African American novels that I ever was exposed to in a formal learning environment. I know that's hard for those of you today to believe because African American literature seems so ubiquitous today. Well, just a few years ago, I'm not that old, but just a few years ago, when I was in high school and in college, it was still quite controversial, and people were fighting the good fight to get African American literature, Latino literature included in the curriculum. So for me, the first African American novel that I ever read was The Color Purple. And it was because the movie was out that they had just made based on the book by Alice Walker. And my high school AP English teacher, who I came to talk to about this great movie I'd seen, and she was like, well, there's a book too. And she brought the book to school the next day for me. And that was my first experience with an African American novel. We had never read one in school. There were none in the curriculum, but that was my introduction. in college, I would be introduced to Baldwin the way that many people get introduced to Baldwin, through his first novel, Go Tell It on the Mountain. And in some ways, Go Tell It on the Mountain is, and I'm happy to talk about why it's the obvious choice that people use to introduce people to Baldwin. I don't think it's necessarily the best choice, but it is the obvious choice. But in some ways, it's also unlike many of the novels or his work that follows or that comes after. Giovanni's Room, for example, much more akin to Just Above My Head, Another Country, etc., than Go Tell It on the Mountain, I would argue. So we're happy to talk about that during Q&A later. But it's the obvious choice in some ways because it's the most it fits most easily into the kind of racialized construction of what an African-American novel ought to be, right? So I was introduced to Baldwin in that way. And then in graduate school, at the age of 23, the tender age of 23, that seems a lifetime ago now, I was struggling with my own sexual identity, and a friend of mine recommended Giovanni's Room, and that was my introduction to this novel at that moment in my 23-year-old life, and it became extremely important to me. And I thought, oh my God, I'm not alone. There are other people like me who have really trod this ground before, who have had this experience. And that was one of the most incredible gifts, in a way, that Baldwin could ever have given to me. Though one of the biggest disappointments of life is that I never had a chance to meet Baldwin. Baldwin used to spend time visiting college campuses, et cetera. But I was just right after the generation of folks that got to meet Baldwin in person. Since then, of course, and I've been involved with Baldwin scholarship really since the mid to late 1990s, and published a book on Baldwin, James Baldwin Now, in 1999, that really, in some ways, created a bit of a revival of Baldwin scholarship in the scholarly community. And that has been exciting to be a part of as well. I've had a chance since then to meet his sister, Gloria Smart, who has become a friend. I had a chance to work with Toni Morrison when I was an undergraduate. I was her research assistant for 2 years. She is still the literary executor to the Baldwin estate. So I had a kind of interesting to Baldwin, an insight into Baldwin, and Baldwin had been a really important part of her life, and vice versa. So my own experience with Baldwin were both deeply personal, but also deeply academic. So today I want to spend a little bit of time talking briefly, and I'm going to talk for no more than 40 minutes, probably less, and try and leave plenty of time for questions. I know some of you have read the book. Some of you may not have read the book. That's okay. I will give lots of quotes today that will be from the book, so we can always refer back to them if you have questions. And when we get to Q&A, I'm happy to answer questions about both my interpretation, reading of the book, the novel, but also about my own journey with Baldwin, or frankly, anything you want to talk about. If you want to talk about higher education, and I'm happy to talk about that too. So any number of issues we can cover today, and happy to be here and happy to take your questions. So we'll start with an interview from the latter years of Baldwin's life that was captured by Karen Thorsen, who I got to meet this summer at a Baldwin conference in France. She did a documentary in 1989 called James Baldwin, The Price of the Ticket. And when asked to reflect upon why he chose so early on to write Giovanni's Room, it was his second novel after all. Given that he was already dealing with the burden of being a black writer in America, Baldwin's response was quite instructive. He says, well, one could say almost that I didn't have an awful lot of choice. Giovanni's Room comes out of something that tormented and frightened me, the question of my own sexuality. It also simplified my life in another way because it meant that I had no secrets. Nobody could blackmail me. You know, you didn't tell me, I told you. Baldwin's attempt here to break the bonds of racial respectability, and he challenges the boundaries of what could count as African-American literature with this novel. After all, this is a novel by a black gay writer with no black characters that takes place in Paris, right? So we'll talk about why that happens and why that is and why Baldwin thinks that's important. But in creating such a product, I mean, Baldwin is also challenging in some ways what we understand to be the domain of African American literature. So Alain Locke, another critic and thinker of the Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s and 1930s, had complained cogently in an essay that he wrote in 1950 about the strictures and the limitations that respectability politics placed on black artists. Now let me say a word about this thing that I will come back to again and again, respectability politics. This is one of the things I do, right, and am known for talking about in scholarly circles. So I'm convinced that part of the project, if you will, of black anti-racist struggle, right? That is, when we are in the process of resisting the discrimination against African Americans, part of that process politically for us is that we have to present or represent a certain picture of black life and culture that is deeply respectable, that is beyond reproach, that, you know, all black people are amazing, we're smart, we're phenomenal, we are without fault, we don't do anything wrong, right? So an example of this might be, everyone knows the story of Rosa Parks, right? Rosa Parks sat down on a bus and the civil rights movement was born. And Rosa Parks was deeply, deeply important, right? But there were plenty of women and men who sat down on buses, black women and men, before Rosa Parks, right? Including a young African-American woman who was a single mother, but was not quite the right image that we wanted to portray, right, in the media of black respectable politics, right? So Rosa Parks was the secretary of the NAACP, right? A church lady, a very nice, respectable, upstanding member of the community. That is someone around whom we can build a movement, right? So the politics of respectability work in very interesting ways to include certain people, but also to exclude certain people. The politics of respectability have been a part of the feminist movement. The politics of respectability have been a part of the civil rights, racial civil rights movement. The politics of respectability have more recently been a part of the marriage equality debate with the LGBT civil rights movement, right? So who are the couples that we get to see around marriage equality? Those are tightly controlled, right? We want certain kinds of images, certain kinds of couples with certain kinds of longevity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So a part of what Baldwin is also up against is that politics of respectability. That's the thing that I'm most intellectually interested in African American literary studies, okay? So it seems more possible today than ever before to engage a prophetic Baldwin, and I think Baldwin was quite prophetic, in all of the complexity that he represents, by considering the various roles that he's occupied. Baldwin was no more content to be simply a black writer, a gay writer, an activist, than he was to write exclusively in the genre of the novel, drama, poetry, or the essay, all of which he did. And the subject of his work and the landscape of his critical and creative imagination are quite broad. Early scholarship on Baldwin, however, has often tended to relegate Baldwin to one or the other of these identities, rather than thinking and moving not only Baldwin, but of African American studies more generally, in a direction that speaks to the intricate social positions that African Americans occupy in our society. This is largely because the trend in scholarship itself in the 1950s and the early 1960s was ostensibly to identify a particular theme, a category, or a political ideology at work in a text or across a body of work by a single author, to fix that variable as part of the process of examining the work in question. Now, neither Baldwin's life nor his work are given over easily to such an approach. So try to follow, for example, the deployment of a single idea like home, or, and we'll come back to home is very important, nothingness in the context of Giovanni's Room, and one immediately begins to perceive the difficulty of reading Baldwin. Baldwin's difficult. Ideas are rarely static for Baldwin. Rather, they're drawn to reflect the complex experience of those ideas in our lives. This represents perhaps one of the reasons that the amount of scholarly production on Baldwin until very recently has been relatively sparse when you compare that with someone like a Richard Wright or a Ralph Ellison. Baldwin wrote as much, if not more, but has not been given the same kind of critical attention until very recently. I did a search actually once just as a thought experiment. So I looked at the MLA bibliography and I put in the names Richard Wright, Ralph Ellison, James Baldwin. Baldwin was significantly lower just in terms of the reference count than those two writers, which is kind of shocking when you think about it, right? But I think that explains also some of the respectability of politics at work, even in the scholarly community, right? So that's not to say that Baldwin, the figure, the man, has not been of great interest, nor that he has not appeared or shown up often in aphoristic and epigraphic ways. Baldwin's words have been used in the work of film directors ranging from Marlon Riggs to Spike Lee, alluded to and cited in black popular gay fiction, quoted by notable African-American cultural critics, the likes of Henry Louis Gates Jr. at Harvard and Cornel West. Still, what has gone missing is sustained critical engagement with Baldwin's context in the thoroughly active way that the criticism has continued to engage a Richard Wright, for example. Another colleague at UNC Chapel Hill, Trudy Harris, writes the following, and I'll share the quote here. On occasion, she says, I was surprised to discover that a writer of Baldwin's reputation evoked such vague memories from individuals in the scholarly community, most of whom maintained that they had read one or more of Baldwin's fictional works. When I began a thorough examination of Baldwin's scholarship, however, some of that reaction became clearer. Baldwin seemed to be read at times for the sensationalism that readers anticipate in his work. But his treatment in scholarly circles is not commensurate to that claim to sensationalism or to his more solidly justifiable literary reputation. It was discouraging, therefore, to think that one of America's best-known writers, and certainly one of its best-known black writers, has not attained a more substantial place in the scholarship on African-American writers. So it's interesting, this is from 1985. It's interesting to observe that in 85, Harris could still note with authority her supposition that many read Baldwin for the sensationalism that he and his work represented. What Harris starts to recognize here implicitly, I want to be more explicit about. That is, Baldwin was read in part because, for his exceptionalism, his aberrance, his difference from other black writers. Baldwin provided a generation of African American and American readers with characters who were racialized, sexualized, class-inflected in complex ways. So much so that at times in Baldwin, a reader almost yearns for an overdetermined, naturalistic protagonist like Bigger Thomas, who is the protagonist and main character of Richard Wright's Native Son, or Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. It finally seems possible to understand today Baldwin's vision of and for humanity and its complexity, locating him not as exclusively black, gay, expatriate, activists, or the like, but as an intricate amalgamation of all of those things, which had to be constantly tailored to fit the circumstances in which he was compelled to articulate himself. So I want to suggest first that although Baldwin's work challenges static notions of racial identity, his awareness of the hegemony of the category of race in black anti-racist discourse nevertheless limits the terms of his possible identification with his gay sexuality. That is, in black anti-racist thought, race is primary as the identity construction, right? So black gay man may not signify in the same way that black man does when you think about race or race man, right? And secondly, I want to briefly sketch a reading of Giovanni's Room that suggests that it is Baldwin's understanding of these same identificatory limits that necessitate the whiteness of the characters in the novel. So Baldwin himself, it seems, was well aware of the dangers of trying to synthesize his racial and sexual identities. He understood that his effectiveness as a race man, his impact that he could have as a spokesperson for the race, and Baldwin was quite a spokesperson, very actively involved in the civil rights movement, speaking, marching, very actively involved, depended in part at least on limiting his public activism to his racial politics. Baldwin's statement in Karen Thorsen's documentary that I referred to earlier certainly confirms this in the way that it represents Baldwin's own response to his sexuality. And Baldwin states the following in the documentary. He's cited as saying, "I think the trick is to say yes to life. It is only we of the 20th century who are so obsessed with the particular details of anybody's sex life. I don't think those details make a difference. And I'll never be able to deny a certain power that I've had to deal with, which has dealt with me, which is called love. And love comes in very strange packages. I've loved a few men, I've loved a few women, and a few people have loved me. I suppose that's all that saved my life." Now, if Baldwin's statement here raises the complications of him speaking from a complex racial and sexual identity location, the following excerpt from a television interview with Baldwin illustrates the point even more clearly. And this was Baldwin in one of his famous rants, which I love, so I love reading this as well. "I don't know what most white people in this country feel, but I can only conclude what they feel from the state of their institutions. I don't know if white Christians hate Negroes or not, but I know that we have a Christian church which is white and a Christian church which is black. I don't know if the Board of Education hates black people, but I know the textbooks that they give my children to read and the schools that we go to. Now this is the evidence. You want me to make an act of faith, risking myself, my wife, my woman, my sister, my children, on some idealism which you assure me exists in America, which I've never seen." End quote. Now, this passage is conspicuous, right, for the manner in which Baldwin assumes the voice of representative race man, right? Part of the performance here includes the masking of his specificity, his sexuality, his difference. And in black anti-racist discourse, when all difference is concealed, what emerges is the heterosexual black male risking himself, his wife, his woman, his children. The image of the black man as protector, progenitor, and defender of the race is what Baldwin assumes here. The truth of this rhetorical transformation is that in order to be a representative race man, one must be both heterosexual and male. Now again, it's not my intention here to fault Baldwin for this move, but is to say that even with his own very deep and profound recognition of the politics of his circumstance, he does find ways to mount a counter discourse, usually through his fiction, to such exclusive racial identity constructions. So now I want to turn to Giovanni's Room to sort of take a look at the fictional work itself, to elaborate a bit further on this character of Baldwin's counter discourse in this regard. Now, Baldwin makes plain in 1957, the year that Giovanni's Room is published, that has come to be, what has now come to be a received part of public discourse about homosexuality in America. That is, one of the reasons that people fear queer sexuality so violently is that it threatens an ideology in America older and stronger even than baseball and apple pie. It threatens the very idea of home, right? Now, I'm going to bracket, in the name of time today, the longer discussion about that concept of home and the fact that there are even languages, French being a good example, where there's no word for that concept. In French, you can say chez moi, you can say à la maison, at my house, or so you talk about the physical edifice, but that idea of this nebulous thing called building a home, right, that we have the concept for in America is not conceptually existent in many languages, right, which is fascinating to me, right? But I'm going to bracket that for the moment, but I just want to make the point. So this is what Baldwin understands so well in Giovanni's Room through the representation of the complexity of David's character. Now, David's the main character, for those of you who may not have read the novel yet, in the novel. He's an American in Paris, deep in thought and trouble and all kinds of drama going on in his life. So the complexity of David's character, drawn as he is at the crossroads of his nationality, his Americanness, his sexuality, his homosexuality or his bisexuality, and home, or the place and social responsibility or respectability that is expected of David. Now, in order that the themes of this work might be universalized, and that is a book that is capable of transmitting these themes to a broad audience so that people can see themselves in the work. That's what we mean when we talk about universal. And that's a concept, happy to come back to that, deeply controversial as well in literary studies, but for the moment we'll go with it. Baldwin knew enough about how race works in America to know that it was impossible to use black characters. In a letter dated January 1954 to William Cole, this is while he was working on the novel, he was the editor who first brought Baldwin's Go Tell It on the Mountain to the attention of his publisher. Baldwin himself wrote the following words about Giovanni's Room shortly after he had begun working on the novel. And I quote, "It's a great departure for me, and it makes me rather nervous. It's not about Negroes, first of all. Its locale is the American colony in Paris. What is really delicate about it is that since I want to convey something about the kinds of American loneliness, I must use the most ordinary type of American I can find. The good, white, Protestant is the kind of image that I want to use. This is precisely the type of American about whose setting I know the least. Whether this will be enough to create a real human being, only time will tell. It's a love story, short and, wouldn't you know it, tragic. Our American boy comes to Europe, finds something, loses it, and in his acceptance of his loss becomes, to my mind, heroic." Now here we see, among other things, that only whiteness is sufficient to represent the large, broad, universal concerns. To Baldwin's mind, black characters in their always overdrawn specificity in our minds could only represent in the 1950s popular imagination the problems specific to blacks, and therefore easily dismissed as irrelevant beyond those confines. Another literary critic put the entire business of the whiteness of Baldwin's characters in Giovanni's Room somewhat differently, though along similar lines of thought, when he wrote, and I quote, "If the characters had been black, the novel would have been read as being about blackness, whatever else it happened actually to be about. The whiteness of the characters seems to make invisible the question of how race or color has, in fact, shaped the characters, at least as far as most readers have dealt with the novel." I'm going to skip the rest of this quote for the sake of time. Giovanni's Room is not a novel about gay sexuality as much as it is about the social forces that make of gay sexuality a problem. Right? So even in this context, however, Baldwin does not sacrifice the complexity of social forces involved in the process. Everywhere in Giovanni's Room, national identity, for example, is sexualized. Consider the following scene from David's visit to the American Express office in Paris, which you might remember, and how he describes the Americans there. David says, "At home, I could have distinguished patterns, habits, accents of speech with no effort whatever. Now everybody sounded, unless I listened hard, as though they had just arrived from Nebraska. At home, I could have seen the clothes they were wearing, but here I only saw bags, cameras, belts, hats, all clearly from the same department store. At home, I would have had a sense of the individual womanhood of the woman I faced. Here, the most ferociously accomplished seemed to be involved in some ice-cold or sun-dried travesty of sex, and even grandmothers seemed to have no traffic with the flesh. And what distinguished the men was that they seemed incapable of age. They smelled of soap, which seemed indeed to be their preservative against the dangers and the exigencies of any more intimate odor. The boy, he had been shown somehow unsoiled, untouched, unchanged through the eyes of the man of 60 booking passage with a smiling wife to roam. Now, American Innocence, I'm going to bracket that for the moment in the sake of time, but if you want to come back to that, happy to talk about my whole theory of Forrest Gump and why that was such a problematic movie around the question of American innocence, which I think is related to this here. But we're going to bracket that for the moment. So David sees these Americans abroad in the new light of the foreigner's eye. The language that he invokes to characterize them is not dissimilar in tone from the language that Giovanni will later use to describe David himself in the heart of their final argument in the novel. Especially noteworthy here is the claim that Americans preserve a kind of innocence that has no traffic with the flesh. Now, part of David's dilemma throughout the novel is that he views sexual identity as in need of domestication, of taming, so that it can be turned into home, right? Again, witness the despair that David has about wandering. I hope you really picked up on the amount of times that that word is used by David in the novel. He talks about wandering and his sorrow and shame and panic and the great bitterness about the beast Giovanni had awakened in him, right? He's horrified and in utter fear of this thing that he sees in himself. He talks about it as a cavern, and I mean, it's a dark cavern, it's awful, it's opening up, it's swallowing him, blah, blah, blah. This sense of home, of fixity, stability, represented by both America and his father in the novel, comes through most clearly in David's father's letter to David, where we learn of David's surely tongue-in-cheek nickname, Butch. I thought that was fabulous. So the father writes, and I quote, "Dear Butch, aren't you ever coming home? Don't think I'm only being selfish, but it's true. I'd like to see you. I think you've been away long enough. God knows I don't know what you're doing over there, and you don't write often enough for me to even guess. But my guess is that you're going to be sorry one of these fine days that you stayed over there looking at your navel and let the world pass you by. There's nothing over there for you. You're as American as pork and beans, though you may not want to admit it. No, you may not want to think so anymore." So David's father's obsession in this letter is in part with time, right? Again, this is an obsession that Giovanni also will identify as very American in his very first conversation with David in the novel. To David's father's mind, if David is not being a man of action and in accordance with a rather predetermined heteronormative script about life, then he is wasting time. He's wandering. Wandering is an important theme in Giovanni's room. Wandering or lack of focus are associated with wayward sexualities. Hella in Spain, David with Giovanni, Jacques and Guillaume with their many boys, etc. It's dangerous. David queries at one of the moments when he faces the fear. David queries at one of the moments when he faces the fears of his sexuality. He says, "The beast which Giovanni had awakened in me would never go to sleep again. Would I then, like all the others, find myself turning and following all kinds of boys down God knows what dark avenues into what dark places?" Right? Or recall Hella's statement to David near the end of the novel, where she describes the domesticated opposite of wandering. "Please," she says to David, "I want to go home. I want to get married. I want to start having kids. I want us to live someplace. And I want you. Please, David, what are we marking time over here for?" Okay. Our queer sexuality in the novel points to desire's ability to be unfocused. The lack of focus, this lack of focus is ultimately one of the biggest threats to heterosexuality in a world where heterosexuality equals focus. Hearth, home, heteronormative pairings are all impossible without the sexual focus that they presuppose in the form of monogamous heterosexual coupling. But life is more complicated than that in Baldwin's vision of the world. David's desire for Hela itself represents his desire for the idea of home, right? Consider the scene when they're reunited at the train station in Paris after she's been away in Spain. I had hoped that when I saw her, something instantaneous, definitive would have happened in me, something to make me know where I should be and where I was, but nothing happened. Then I took her in my arms and something happened then. I was terribly glad to see her. It's really seen with Hela in the circle of my arms that my arms were home. And I was welcoming her back there. She fitted in my arms as she always had, and the shock of holding her had caused me to feel that my arms had been empty since she had been away. Now we know, of course, that had not been the case. Right? Now, if home equals heterosexuality, which equals nationhood, then it is David's desire to fulfill the heteronormative national narrative laid out for him as his American birthright that he recognizes in Hela. Indeed, the lure of it is so strong in this moment that it has the force, even if only for the moment, of erasing any and all of David's prior wayward sexual exploits. He felt as if in his arms, that if his arms had been empty since she had been away. Again, I want to suggest that a rather complicated relationship between home, nation, and sexuality is represented in the text and bears further consideration. So consider the following, and I'll go through these fairly quickly. Joey and the others is a reason for needing to leave home to begin with, needing to remain in constant motion. That's a quote from David as well. Or, I began perhaps to be lonely that summer after Joey, and began that summer, the flight which had brought me to this darkening window. My flight may indeed have begun that summer, which does not tell me where to find the germ of the dilemma which resolved itself that summer into flight. This is David describing his early nights with Hela. I was thinking, no doubt, of our nights in bed, of the peculiar innocence and confidence which will never come again, which had made those nights so delightful, so unrelated to past, present, or anything to come, so unrelated finally to my life, since it was not necessary for me to take any but the most mechanical responsibility for them. And these nights were being acted out under a foreign sky with no one to watch, no penalties attached. It was this last fact, the no penalties attached, right, which was our undoing. For nothing is more unbearable once one has it than freedom. I suppose this was why I asked her to marry me, to give myself something to be moored to. Perhaps this was why in Spain she decided that she wanted to marry me. But people can't, unhappily, invent their mooring posts, their lovers, and their friends any more than they can invent their parents. Life gives these and also takes them away, and the great difficulty is to say yes to life. My father had money in his account which belonged to me, but he was very reluctant to send it because he wanted me to come home, as he said, and settle down. And whenever he said that, I thought of the sediment at the bottom of a stagnant pond. Right? I ached abruptly and intolerably with a longing to go home, not to the hotel in one of the alleys of Paris where the concierge barred the way with my unpaid bill, but home across the ocean to things and people I knew and understood, to those things, those places, those people which I would always helplessly and in whatever bitterness of spirit love above all else. I had never realized such a sentiment in myself before, and it frightened me. I saw myself sharply as a wanderer, an adventurer, rocking through the world unanchored. I looked at Giovanni's face, which did not help me. He belonged to this strange city, which did not belong to me. I began to see that, while what was happening to me was not so strange, as it would have comforted me to believe, yet it was strange beyond belief. It was not really so strange, so unprecedented, though voices deep within me boomed, for shame, that I should be so abruptly, so hideously entangled with a boy. So from the time we begin to hear David's voice and his story in the novel, he is, to the logic of his own mind, already in trouble. An American in Paris, exiled, unfocused, wandering. David is plagued not simply by some nebulous ideology about gay sexuality, but by the complex set of responses that arise when the young American man comes up against the overwhelming weight of what is expected of him in the world. This is the drama that drives David's psychological angst in the narrative. Giovanni names it in the final argument between the two of them in this exchange. And this will be part of the end here. This is one of my favorite moments in the novel because Baldwin really is putting both of the arguments right out in front of us with this scene between David and Giovanni. It's amazing. So David begins, all this love you talk about, isn't it that you want to be made to feel strong? Isn't it just that you want to be made to feel strong? You want to go out and be the big laborer and bring home the money, and you want me to stay here and wash the dishes and cook the food and clean this miserable closet of a room and kiss you when you come in through the door and lie with you at night and be your little girl? That's all you mean when you say you love me. You say I want to kill you. What do you think you've been doing to me? I am not trying to make you a little girl. If I wanted a little girl, I would be with a little girl. Then why aren't you? Isn't it just that you're afraid and you take me because you haven't got the guts to go after a woman, which is what you really want? He was pale. You're the one that keeps talking about what I want. I have only been talking about who I want. So the last word here is Giovanni's. David is still trying to explain his feelings, his sexuality, in terms of a heteronormative cultural narrative. This is why he is consumed by the what, ideological forces. Whereas Giovanni, unhampered by such concerns, is focused on who he loves, David, and not on what it means. This moment should remind us of an earlier one in the same argument between Giovanni and David, where Giovanni first ruminates on why David is leaving him. Giovanni, I said, you always knew that I would leave one day. You knew my fiancée was coming back to Paris. You are not leaving me for her, he said. You're not leaving me for a woman. If you were really in love with that little girl, you wouldn't have to be so cruel to me. She's not a little girl, I said. She's a woman, and no matter what you think, I do love her. You do not, cried Giovanni, sitting up, love anyone. You've never loved anyone. I'm sure you never will. You love your purity. You love your mirror. You are just like a little virgin. You walk around with your hands in front of you as though you had some precious metal, gold, silver, rubies, maybe diamonds down there between your legs. You will never let anybody touch it, man or woman. You want to be clean. You think that you came here covered with soap and that you think that you will go out covered with soap. And you don't want to stink, not even for 5 minutes in the meantime. You want to leave Giovanni because he makes you think of the stink of love. You want to despise Giovanni because he is not afraid of the stink of love. You want to kill him in the name of all of your lying little moralities. So the very virtues that Baldwin extols here in Giovanni, by contrast to David, that is David's obsession with being pure, clean, rendered by association as a very American desire, complicated by his nationality in the novel, are what characterizes the subject matter of Baldwin's work and his art. Like Giovanni, he did not care for purity. Rather, Baldwin wallows in the dirt of the unclean places of the psyche, the cluttered rooms where life for him really happens. David represents the pitfalls and the suffering of a life lived in observance of the rules about what we should be, how we should love, going back to respectability politics, right? What we should be, how we should love, indeed what we should feel. While the price exacted on Giovanni for the choice to live freely in defiance of social order is high, it certainly seems to receive Baldwin's ultimate approval in the novel. While on the other hand, David, though he lives, is the one who represents a more profound death even. Indeed, an emotional death that he must live with. I'm going to close with a quote that I don't have on here, but I just like it, so I'm going to read it. Read it for you anyway. This is from Jacques talking to David in the bar early on in the novel, shortly after David meets Giovanni. So you may recall this moment, and I'll close with this. This is Jacques' advice. Jacques, for those of you who may not have read the novel, Jacques, an older gay man that knows David. David is befriended in Paris, and he and Guillaume are the two older gentlemen who are constantly hanging out with all the boys and et cetera, in the bar and elsewhere. Jacques says this to David about Giovanni. "Love him," said Jacques with vehemence. "Love him and let him love you. Do you think anything else under heaven really matters? And how long at best can it last, since you're both men and still have everywhere to go? Only 5 minutes, I assure you, only 5 minutes, and most of that in the dark. And if you think of them as dirty, they will be dirty. They will be dirty because you will be giving nothing. You will be despising your flesh and his. But you can make your time together anything but dirty. You can give each other something which will make both of you better forever if you will not be ashamed, if you will only not play it safe." He paused, watching me, and then looked down at his cognac. "You play it safe long enough," he said, in a different tone, "and you'll end up trapped in your own dirty body forever and ever and forever, like me." And he finished his cognac, ringing his glass slightly on the bar to attract the attention of Madame Clotilde. And I will end there, and thank you for your very kind attention. And I will open the floor for your questions, your thoughts, your comments, any and all of the above. Thank you.
Questions? I have a mic, so raise your hand. I'll come to you so we can hear you. One at a time.
And this is the teacher in me. I always like to it's okay. We don't have to rush, and there's no, some people have a question right away. Some people have to ruminate. I'm a ruminator. I have to think about things, and it's okay. So we're going to take our time. No rush. I'm comfortable with silence as well. Yeah. Say again? Stunned audience? Oh, wow. Was I stunning? Yes, here. Why don't you introduce yourself, if you don't mind? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Tanika. Yeah. Okay.
Hi, Tanika.
Hi. I haven't actually read Giovanni's Room, but from what I'm hearing and seeing on the screen, it seems pretty good. Like what
it's an amazing novel. Yeah.
It's really good.
Oh, it's fantastic. Yeah.
Okay. I was just wondering. You probably wouldn't know, so I have to ask somebody else about the book being available here. Okay.
Yeah, no, it's a really, I think it's an important book, and one where it's important also where it comes in Baldwin's own career, right? So he first wrote, in terms of the novels, we'll put aside the essays for a moment, but he first wrote Go Tell It on the Mountain, which many aspects of that novel fit into what we would consider to be a rather, there are some, there's a whole argument to be made about that too, and other scholars have made that. But But it fits much more naturally into what we would expect of a kind of coming-of-age story in the context of an African-American novel about a black boy and his best friend, and they're growing up in the church and the complications of that. And so all of that, right? And a lot of it is, of course, based on Baldwin's own autobiography. So it's an interesting novel for that reason. But then that comes out, it does really well, and then Giovanni's Room, right? So you can imagine, like not only the scholarly community, but the publisher, and Baldwin had become already a bit of a known entity at this point, right? I mean, his essays had really gotten a lot of attention. The first novel got a lot of attention, but people had no idea what to do with this book, right? They were just like, really? Like, is this the same James Baldwin, right? I mean, that was really at that level. But I think it also in some ways set him up, in precisely the ways that he himself says, it set him up for a career that really produced some of the most incredible, nuanced work about American life and love and loneliness in the American context that you could possibly ask for. So I think this is, in some ways, many people like to think of writers' first novels as their urtext, or the thing that underlies everything, the foundation. In some ways, I think there's a real argument to be made for Giovanni's Room in some ways being Baldwin's urtext, right? So I think it's a great novel, yeah. Hi.
Can you talk a little bit about Giovanni's Room and the relationship to then some of his other texts?
Yeah.
Especially the nonfiction.
Yeah.
I just read a few of his essays
Yeah.
and was really impressed by kind of the same language that he uses in both, some of the images that he uses both in Giovanni's Room and then later on in some of the civil rights stuff that he's writing.
Sure, absolutely. And in fact, I was talking to Joe earlier. There's a new book of essay, relatively new, in the last 3 years. Randall Keenan, who I've known for quite some time and whose work I've respected for a long time too, came out with a volume. And Joe, if you remember the title of the book, let me know. But he came out with a volume of Baldwin's unpublished essays and unpublished speeches. And it is absolutely incredible, too. I mean, and it adds to a lot of what we already know about Baldwin. But these are shorter pieces that weren't collected in the same way and that weren't formally published. What I would say about this is Baldwin works out more fully in many of his essays. One of my favorites is Here Be Dragons. I mean, that's one of I love that essay. But there are many. I mean, we could talk about any number of them. But he works out in his essays a lot of the ideas that really get to be at the heart of the fiction in the novels, right? So when you look at a book like, for example, Giovanni's Room, where he is talking about kinds of cosmopolitan loneliness, right? He is extraordinarily eloquent about this idea of home and his own relationship to America. He's particularly good about it in the interviews with him. I mean, one of the moments that I recall specifically, he says that, and I'm going to butcher the quote at this point, but that America is my home. He said, and you better have a home, and you better take it with you, or you're homeless, right? So as much time as he spent in France, in Paris, and was very much a part of France and its culture. I mean, he received the French Legion of Honor, one of the highest honors that is bestowed by the French government on a non-citizen. So he was very important in France and to France, but Baldwin always understood himself as an American, and that was really important to him. That was his home. It was a part of his identity, and it was that identity that he struggles with in some ways all of his life, right? And all of the essays, to my mind, all of the fiction, even his forays into the theater, right? I mean, they're all examples of him trying to work through the nuance of that identity, right? And what in that identity is the sort of human bond that speaks more broadly to all of us. So I think that there's a real strong connection between the essays, the novels. The themes are very similar. Baldwin is also, and I will say this about the work more broadly, Baldwin is also a deceptively simple writer, right? So the prose style is not like reading Toni Morrison, right? Toni Morrison's prose, for example, can be a little, not off-putting, because I love it, but it can be hard to approach, unapproachable, right, at first, right? And you have to sort of work with it and break the code, and because it's like reading poetry at moments, right? Baldwin is not that, right? It's a different kind of writing, but the poetry, if you will, of Baldwin's work, to my mind, the poetry of it comes from the way in which he can take an idea and present it to you in almost a surprisingly simple way, and you realize, oh my God, that's really deep, right? And it's that moment that's the poetry, right? It's the moment when you realize, oh, wow, he just took me to some place that I didn't know we were going. I didn't even know we were on the journey. And that's what Baldwin does, right? That's what both in the prose, I mean, in the essays, but also in the fiction, right? And Morrison does that, but in a very different kind of way, right? There are many ways in which they're complementary to each other, but I think that that's one of the things that's unique to Baldwin. He at first seems to be deceptively simple, especially the essays. But when you start to pay attention to the journey he's taking you on, through anecdotes sometimes through political analysis, but it's all sometimes through personal life story and experience. But then the impact of it, you're like, wow, I didn't know we were going there. And all of a sudden I'm at this new place. That's the brilliance of it in some ways, yeah. Yes?
Hi, my name is Alicia.
Alicia.
I had a question. Okay, with James Baldwin, when he was explaining David's character as being heroic at the end of the book, I kind of got a sense that he was kind of like a despicable character only because he turned out to be like a womanizer, this user, you know. And so I was surprised at the end of the book that he found some sort of, you know, heroicness from him.
Yeah.
So I was like, what was his whole, I'm pretty sure he knows, you know,
Yeah.
as far as what he was going with that. But as far as a woman getting, you know, look or views from the book, it kind of seemed like, you know, he kind of put women off. Like
Yeah.
he didn't have any type of interest or respect.
Well, let me ask you this. So, I mean, and we'll broaden the question because that's a good question. Because ultimately, Baldwin does say in that letter to his publisher that and it's interesting, he says, who he thinks really turns out to be heroic. He does waver a bit, right? Even in the formulation of that he uses in the letter. So for those of you who do know the novel, let me broaden the question a bit. So what about where David ends up in the novel, right? Standing in this window with Giovanni's impending death, right? And the trial having happened, et cetera, et cetera. All of this with Hella, and all of this with Giovanni, and all of this with Joey, and all of that behind, right? All of that experience in his rear view, as it were, looking out this window. How would you argue for David's heroism, right, in that moment? I mean, I want to be clear. I don't think all heroes have to be good, right? Because people can be heroic, but not be all good, right? Either. So, how would you argue for David's heroism in that moment when he's standing there at the window at the end with all of this in his rear view? What about that is heroic to you? I mean, unless you all agree that, you know, he's despicable and we just, you know, he's not worth our time and to think about what may be heroic about him.
I do think at the end of the novel, he realized, like he
I don't
said,
think it's on.
Oh.
Yeah. Okay.
I do realize at the end of the novel when he said, you know, you have to put childish things away and finally become this man figure. I'm thinking maybe he had a realization, and maybe in some aspects that was, okay, he realized that it was time for a change. So maybe that was a way of
And
being heroic.
so there's that. So part of it is, right, that, I mean, our life, you know, the good, the bad, the ugly, the good things that we do, the mistakes that we make, in some ways, the amalgamation of those things make us the people that we are, right? If we are reflective people, I want to be very clear about that. Not everyone is reflective, right? So I want to be clear about that too. But reflective people, in some ways, are the amalgamation of the experiences that they've had, good, bad, the ones they regret, the ones they, you know, whatever. So David, if we think about him in this way, I mean, as someone who perhaps, and you're right, he's done some despicable things, right? There's no question. But perhaps if David has become a better human being as a result of those experiences, right? As a result of, in some ways, being forced to travel through the unclean places and the messiness of life and the complexity that had he stayed in America, right? Had he not had the experience, the Joey experience, that might have set him on a very different path that might have looked heroic to us, right? But probably would not have had the same kind of depth that David now is even capable of having, right?
Well, that brings me to my next question. As far as do you sympathize with David? I'm sorry, David's character. Do you sympathize with him?
You know, I'm not. It's interesting. I never really kind of think about my own. My sympathies are with Giovanni.
Yeah.
I mean, in the novel, to be sure. I mean, just speaking on a deeply personal level, intellectually. I mean, it's kind of like, okay, it's kind of like reading Paradise Lost, right? I mean, on the one hand, when you read Milton and you read Paradise Lost, your sympathies are, of course, on the side of good and are with Jesus and heaven and blah blah blah, and the angels, but your interests intellectually are often with Satan. His character is just far more interesting, right? Now, I don't mean to make this good and bad, because it's not that simple. That's part of what Baldwin is trying to trouble. So for me, yeah, my sympathies are clearly with Giovanni. I think Giovanni is right. I mean, he says the things that I would want to say in the novel, right? He says the things to David that I would want to say to David. But at the same time, David's journey is quite compelling because it also is representative of a whole lot more people's journey, right?
Yeah, that was why I was like, okay, why didn't James Baldwin? Because mainly it seemed like, okay, it was about David, and it wouldn't have been a different turnout if it was really about Giovanni's story. Because we only see David's point of view versus we got a little bit.
We got a little bit of Giovanni's point of view, but the story is told from David's point of view. That's
exactly.
right. Yeah.
And would it have changed up if it was about Giovanni?
Yeah. Well, I think in part, though, even that's a choice, right? Baldwin chooses to tell the story from David's point of view because that's the point of view in some ways that he wants to interrogate.
Exactly.
Because I think Baldwin also agrees with Giovanni, right? I mean, ultimately, if I were, again, to speculate,
Right.
I think Baldwin probably agrees most with Giovanni too, but the position that he really wants to interrogate in this novel, right, the nuance that he wants to get to is David's, right,
Yeah.
and his suite of problems and issues, right?
And
Yeah.
I'm thinking, because I kind of got the whole, where he wanted to relate to those who were afraid of homosexuality versus those who were, kind of a comparison with those who were comfortable with their sexuality.
Absolutely. That's absolutely right, yeah.
Because
Yeah, Joe.
I'm glad you asked your first question, because it was really mine, because there's a way in which I read this 25 years ago, and I'm rereading it. I'm more sympathetic to David now than I certainly was at the time.
Oh, yeah. And I'm more sympathetic to him now than I was first time I read this, too, right? I thought he was a total louse as well the first time I read this novel.
Because
Yeah.
to me,
Yeah.
is it fair to call this novel a 150-page drunk call? It's like
You have to
somebody
say more,
in the
Joe.
night who just has to tell you,
Yeah.
like everything they've ever done
yeah,
wrong, come
yeah.
clean. You know, I'm staring out the window. Look what I did to Hella. Look what I did to Giovanni.
Yeah.
And it really challenges me on that.
Yeah.
You know,
No, that's
as
interesting.
as eloquent as you've laid it out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's that call you get from the friend who has had one too many, and then they start just confessing everything and oh my God, I can't believe I'm a terrible person. Yeah, no, I could see that.
I think that's why I have trouble thinking about David as a hero, because I wonder, okay, once he sobers up, where is he going to be? Did he really figure it out? Is he really going to take the next step?
Well,
I think
and
there's
Baldwin
a
leaves
question.
that open, right? He does not. He doesn't get, because part of me. I mean, I'm a sucker for a neat ending too, right? I mean, though that's not the kind of. Those are not the kinds of narratives that we typically get to talk about in the Academy, right? We are interested in narratives with complex endings and blah blah blah. But this. I wanted to believe that David was going to become a better person, but Baldwin doesn't give us that. He gives the possibility. I mean, so we literally feel like we're standing at this crossroads. David can either go back to being the jerk that he was, or he can move from this place to go to someplace very different. And Baldwin has even charted out what that different will look like in the person of Giovanni, who is now literally dead, right? So David, I mean, it's the opportunity for a rebirth, if you, I mean, not to get overly symbolic, but he doesn't give it to us. He leaves it, and in part because, again, I don't know that he wants to close that off, because you're right. I mean, David's story is more every man's story than Giovanni's is, right? Every man.
By not closing it off, it gives you that self-reflection.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's absolutely right.
Good. Other questions? That's probably a good note to end on. So
Thank you all
let me say
so much
thank
for
you.
being
Thank you,
here.
Dean
Really,
McBride. Have a
really
round of
appreciate it. It was
applause.
fabulous. Absolutely fabulous. Thank you.
And let me say